Mojtaba Khamenei began his first day as Iran's supreme leader with his capital city shrouded in smoke as the US and Israel struck 5 Iranian oil depots. The price of oil surged on global markets as a refinery in Bahrain also burned from Iranian drone strikes. Explosions rang out across Beirut as Israel is accused of using chemical weapons in Lebanon.
The new face of the Iranian Islamic regime. Mojtaba Khamenei was appointed to succeed his father as the country's supreme leader last night. Supporters took to the streets and celebrations continued today. Mojtaba is a hardliner with close links to the Revolutionary Guard, and his appointment is in defiance of the US, who warned against it. But he takes power with the capital Tehran engulfed in black smoke as the US and Israel struck 5 oil depots overnight. Iran responded with a drone attack on a refinery in Bahrain. Oil futures surged past $100 a barrel, their highest level since 2022, and stock markets plummeted, amid fears that the selection of a hardline supreme leader could signal a longer war. Donald Trump tried to play down the significance, saying expensive oil was a small price to pay for world peace. But that peace seems a distant prospect, as Israeli bombs rang out across Beirut this morning. Human Rights Watch said the Israeli military unlawfully fired white phosphorus munitions in southern Lebanon. And Iranian strikes hit civilian targets in Bahrain and Israel overnight. US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth again refused to accept responsibility for the bombing of a school in southern Iran on the opening day of the war that killed dozens of 7 to 12-year-old girls.
If you could tell the American public it definitively was not us, you would tell us, wouldn't you?
I would say that it's being investigated, which is the only answer I'm prepared to give.
Iran's foreign ministry rejected any ceasefire this morning. The country has a new supreme leader. Bombs are exploding across the region and there's no end in sight. Fergal Gallagher, RTE News.
G7 finance ministers have stopped short of endorsing the release of hundreds of millions of gallons of oil from strategic global reserves in order to cool spiralling oil prices, while Eurozone finance ministers meeting in Brussels have called for all options to be kept open. Earlier, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa held an emergency video call with 14 Gulf, Arab and regional leaders.
The Iran war is already having a shock effect on the global economy, not least in Europe, where high energy prices have long been seen as a drag on competitiveness. Some member states have higher energy costs than others, but big European economies like Germany, Spain and Italy are uniquely exposed to the war in the Gulf because they source most of their crude oil from there. Eurozone finance ministers meeting in Brussels were looking at how an uneven energy market might respond, with Germany keen that the G7 keep open the option of releasing hundreds of millions of barrels of oil from strategic reserves to cool prices. France earlier chaired a meeting of G7 finance ministers.
We are ready to take necessary and coordinated steps in order to stabilize markets, such as strategic stockpiling.
The president of the Eurogroup warned that high energy prices were not the only threat to Europe's economy.
The impact that Europe can have from this crisis can manifest itself not only through prices in energy, but also through other variables, the cost of fertilizers, air traffic.
Spain reasserted its opposition to the war not only on international law grounds.
We will not participate in this unilateral war, which is outside of the realm of international law. What we're feeling is already the consequences of this war. We're feeling them not only in international markets in terms of volatility, but also in our pockets in terms of how fast also gas prices are increasing.
The presidents of the European Commission and Council held a video call with 14 Gulf, Arab and regional leaders. Earlier, President von der Leyen said Europe's reliance on international rules appeared no longer fit for purpose.
We need a clear-eyed, hard look at our foreign policy in today's world, both in how it is designed and how it is deployed.
That is a debate for another day. As shipping on the Strait of Hormuz grinds to a halt, the European and global economies have more pressing concerns.
And we can speak to Tony now. And Tony, there were interesting comments there from Ursula von der Leyen today that Europe can no longer rely on the old world order. How are they being interpreted?
That's right, Tommy. Now, Ursula von der Leyen was addressing a conference of about 120 EU ambassadors who are really paid to project European Union influence and soft power across the world. Now, what she's essentially saying here is that once again Europe has been caught in a war not of its making. European allies have been hit. The European economy is going to be hit. European citizens are stranded in some of the countries affected. And once again, she's raised this issue of how Europe makes decisions and making the point that Europe can no longer be the custodian, as she put it, of the international rules-based order, which of course is something the EU has always championed, especially since the arrival of Donald Trump in his second term and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But what she's saying here is that Europe will have to look at how it projects its foreign policy and its influence in the world, and essentially saying that the way Europe does its foreign policy through a system of veto-based consensus, having to get all 27 member states on board for a particular position, that may not be fit for purpose in the world that we live in. Now, she didn't say how that might be changed, and of course changing that system could possibly require treaty change. But again, she's signalling that this system is now perhaps not as effective as it was during a stable post-war era of multilateralism.
Tony Connelly in Brussels, thank you. Well, as you've been hearing, oil prices soared to almost $119 a barrel earlier today, while stock and bond markets fell as the Iran crisis continues. Some major producers cut supplies and fears of prolonged shipping disruptions gripped the market.
Prices are escalating rapidly at Irish forecourts. Diesel reached €2.08 and petrol over €1.90 in some stations. And 500 litres of home heating oil reached €880 this afternoon, up from less than €500 this day last week. It's all been driven by higher oil costs. A barrel cost just under $100 this afternoon. It was $60 at the beginning of the year.
We've seen a cut in production in oil, we've seen oil fields closed, and the knock-on impact of that is to reduce supply in the region and put upward pressure on global oil prices.
While the first effects of this oil shock are being experienced by motorists and consumers of home heating oil, the longer it goes on, the broader the effect will be. For example, goods we buy in supermarkets are transported by hauliers who use diesel. When those costs go up, they're passed on to consumers, so it means prices begin to go up everywhere. The opposition has called on the government to act.
We believe it's time for government to introduce targeted measures for households, the sort of thing that we saw before in 2022, and indeed what we in the Labour Party have called for. For example, extension of 4 further weeks on the fuel allowance.
In Brussels, the Taoiseach cautioned against moving too quickly.
This is a conflict that is a week old, and at the moment it's hard to predict whether this is something that lasts for a period of more days or weeks, or indeed something that lasts for months. And there's a very, very different economic impact and perhaps therefore a very different economic response required.
The problem for consumers is that these higher costs come after years of escalating prices.
Well, let's get more analysis on that now. David is here in studio and our Washington correspondent, Jackie Fox, is standing by. David, to you first. As prices rise, people will be looking to the government to see if there are any supports that can be offered. Do you think they'll be forthcoming?
Well, the thing is that the government has just got rid of energy credits, which were on electricity bills in the last budget. Now, the other thing that they can do is obviously tax changes, but they would seem unlikely at the moment because those type of changes benefit everybody in society. In other words, the well-off and the less well-off. And they're more likely in the short term to think about the fuel allowance, potentially extending that, as we saw referenced in that report. The other thing is that while prices are going up, what we're going to see is inflation begin to creep up too. And the only way to counteract inflation is by increasing interest rates. Now, that will be an issue if it does happen for homeowners, potentially putting up mortgage rates. So the problem is for consumers, they could be in a pincer movement of higher prices and higher interest rates.
All right. And Jackie Fox, in the US, President Trump is trying to reassure people about rising prices by downplaying them.
That's right, Sharon. The big worry here, like everywhere else, is those rising energy prices, and people are starting to see those soaring prices at the gas pump. It is $3.50 per gallon at a petrol station here in the United States. That is an 18% increase compared to last month. And these are economic figures that are being broadcast at many street corners across the United States. President Trump, yes, he is downplaying these price rises, saying they are a very small price to pay and that they will be temporary. However, there is an acknowledgement within the Trump administration that this is an issue. President Trump himself has floated the idea of the US Navy escorting ships through the Strait of Hormuz, transit there effectively at a standstill. It has also allowed India to temporarily buy Russian oil to keep that oil market flowing. House Republicans are due to hear from President Trump within the coming hours, and they could start feeling the heat from their constituents soon, because price rises are poison for the party in power, especially during an election year. So it'll be interesting to see if President Donald Trump talks about those price rises when he meets those House Republicans in Florida today.
Washington correspondent Jackie Fox and Economics and Public Affairs editor David Murphy, thank you both.
Well, for more on this, we're joined by our political coverage editor, Joe McGrailey. He's standing by at Leinster House. And Joe, this was discussed at Cabinet today around whether the government should intervene to help bring down the cost of energy for people. But there does appear to be some reluctance on the part of government to do that.
Yes, indeed, Tommy. There was a cabinet meeting today. This was discussed, and I think it's fair to say that ministers are well aware of the effects of rising prices because, of course, they're in their constituencies for the weekend. And one minister told me that even, driving into Dublin today, he was making note of all of the different prices and the increasingly high prices for petrol and diesel that you could see at fuel stations. But nevertheless, as you say, the decision from the government is that they're going to continue to monitor the situation. They're going to continue to keep the prices under review, because the thinking is that this war is only a week old. There's no idea yet whether or not it will be a prolonged conflict, although it doesn't immediately look like peace is going to break out. And also, in the case of the Ukraine war, when that happened back in 2022 and there were eventually reliefs introduced, they didn't come for about 4 weeks or a month into that conflict. So the government are very definitely looking at it in that regard. They're going to keep things under review, and they're also, of course, going to be taking part in the discussions at EU level, both by finance ministers and by EU leaders next week, which will also be focusing on this cost of living crisis that's arising as a result of these soaring costs.
And separately, Joe, over the weekend, President Connelly strongly criticised the ongoing war in the Middle East. Has there been any reaction from the government to those comments?
Yes, a response from the government this afternoon, a pointed response, I suppose you could say, Tommy, to the President. Just to remind people, what she said in a speech for International Women's Day was that what was going on in the Middle East was shocking and numbing and a deliberate assault on international law. And she said that had to be named as such without equivocation. So the government response today came from a spokesperson who said that the government fully respects the constitutional role of and office of President Connelly, but it's important to recall that responsibility for international affairs lies with the government. So no doubt at all, it's a very clear message that has been publicly communicated to Áras an Uachtaráin. We haven't had any response from the Áras yet. And one final thing, Tommy, it's also been confirmed this evening by the Department of Foreign Affairs that a second chartered flight will be chartered by the government to bring people home from the Middle East. This one will come from Abu Dhabi in UAE. It'll be later this week. People will have to pay a fee again later this week, possibly on Wednesday, we're told.
Joe McGrailey at Leinster House, thank you. Now, last Friday, Irish soldiers in southern Lebanon provided both casualty and firefighting assistance after a strike on the Ghanaian United Nations base. The strike happened about 3 to 4 kilometres from Camp Shamrock, where Irish troops are located. Lebanon has blamed Israel for the incident. UNIFIL has said it's investigating who was behind it. 3 Ghanaian troops were injured. Well, we're now joined by Commandant Alex Quigley of the Irish Defence Forces. And thanks indeed for speaking to us on 6-1. Can you talk us through what happened last Friday and how the Irish troops responded?
Yeah, so I suppose there was a heavy fire in the region and a decision was made to go to groundhog, which is our kind of term that we use for going to bunkers. Whilst that was ongoing, the Ghanaian post 5-66 was hit by a number of strikes from fire. A decision was made at the time then that to deploy some of the quick reaction force as well as some of the armoured ambulance and firefighters to the Ghanaian post to provide assistance and casualty evacuation. One of the Ghanaian soldiers had been severely wounded and a decision was made that the Italian aeromedical team needed to evacuate them. 5-66 has a helipad, but if I can paint a picture, it would have been dark. There would have been a lot of fire.
Yeah, we actually saw pictures of the aftermath there, so a really difficult, challenging place to operate in.
Absolutely, and the decision was made then that we would extract them, we'd hand the casualty over to the Irish Armoured Ambulance, and we would move them back to 2-45, the Irish camp, to extract them. And at that time, firefighting then took place to help the camp.
I suppose naturally an incident like this would raise questions around whether something like this is likely to happen again, and whether it's safe to keep Irish troops where they are.
Yes, I mean, what I'd say to that is that the region is volatile, but that's why we're there. So our troops in the army prepare extensively from the moment you join the Irish Defences to when you go overseas for these deployments. We do an extensive pre-deployment training culminating in an overseas exercise which simulates UNIFIL and all of the actions that may happen in southern Lebanon. So our troops are prepared to be out there. And what I would...
Is it becoming more dangerous, though? The RT Clarity team have reported on how there's been several air strikes, drone strikes. There's more ground activity, significantly more ground activity in recent days. Is it becoming more challenging for them to operate there?
Certainly, the volatility is rising. But again, that's what our personnel and our army personnel are there to be for, to provide support to both the Lebanese armed forces and the people of South Lebanon. What I would say to anyone at home, for example, that is concerned, our army personnel undergo a massive amount of training and have faith in them out there. You know, our operations staff in Defence Force headquarters, we have no concerns over the likelihood of supply issues or rations or real life support. But our personnel, they want to be there. You know, joining the Defence Forces and deploying overseas is the pinnacle of an army career. So our personnel are there prepared.
So when it comes to getting food and water into the troops, there's no issues around that. What's the mood like amongst the troops at the moment?
I only spoke actually to the company commander overseas, Commandant Conor Hurley, this morning, and the mood is high, morale is high. Our army personnel are getting to do, you know, what they've trained to do. As I said, that's why we joined the Defence Forces. Like I still remember being 12 years old, being handed a leaflet with a UN flag and an Irish Defence Forces logo on it, deciding that day what I wanted to do. It's the same for the majority of our army personnel. You know, we're out there for a reason.
If there were to be a major incident, can troops be evacuated quickly?
Absolutely, and we saw that only on Friday. We had armoured ambulance, excellent medical staff stabilising casualties, and an Italian aeromedical team extracting them to a hospital. So there are plans in place for all the eventualities.
We have 358 Irish soldiers out there. On a practical level, when something like this happens, naturally families back here in Ireland will be very concerned. How quickly are you guys able to communicate with family back at home?
Yeah, so myself through the Defence Forces Press Office will update on social media, and we have family liaison officers who can be contacted for information. But I would say, you know, I've been overseas before. I would have left a wife behind, a family behind. I know how difficult it is in them, and we can't do what we do without their support. But what I would say to the families at home is to have faith in your loved ones' training, the training of those around them, and understand that they have a job to do, they need to focus, and you need to trust them and the plans that we have in place.
All right, Commandant Alex Quigley, thanks indeed for speaking to us on 6-1.
Thank you.
Returning now to the intensifying war in the Middle East, and as consumers worry about the effect the increase in oil prices is already having, economists are looking at the longer-term impacts. Well, I'm joined now by Kate English, Chief Economist with Deloitte Ireland. Kate, thanks so much for coming in to speak to us on 6-1. Perhaps we could start off with where the markets ended up today, because it was pretty chaotic this morning.
Well, I suppose we ended today with markets having eased from where they began this morning. I think I said last week that the key variable with all this was going to be time. And we're beginning to see that take hold within markets. When we're in a slightly different position to where we were at the invasion of Ukraine, that was a dramatic event that had an immediate reaction on prices. Instead now, with events taking place in the Gulf, it is markets trying to assess, will this last weeks, days, months? And we also saw today, for the first time since April 2nd last year, when we saw widespread tariffs introduced by the US administration, quite a spike in a volatility index, the VIX index, which continues to show that today markets are more concerned that this is going to last longer.
Right, and people at home they'll be seeing the price increases in home heating oil and fuel at the pumps. But I suppose they'll be worrying that we are guaranteed to see price increases across the board when oil goes up. Is that the case?
Inflation is the biggest risk here. When we look at the Gulf region, we know that there are products produced that feed across the entire supply chain. Think of fossil fuels that are used within factories, fertiliser prices that will impact food costs as well, energy that is required to in data centres, also, and in pharmaceutical plants. So every single impact of our economy could potentially be impacted here. Again, that key variable is time. The longer that supply chains or indeed production of these fossil fuels is impacted, the more the risk of that inflation comes through. The question is, will we see a short, sharp rise in inflation that then dissipates? Or will it indeed be something that's more systematic and a more long-lasting inflation?
And what could be the longer-term impacts then? If you have markets that are jittery, how does that impact on interest rates, government borrowing, all of those things?
If we see that more long-term inflation come through, I think we will see consumers and both businesses hurt. And that will impact our overall level of economic growth as well. Similarly, as that inflation outlook is beginning to change, we're seeing that play out in the bond market with a rise in government bonds as markets now expect that we may not see interest rate cuts coming from certain central banks. And indeed, we could see further interest rate hikes as the year progresses. But we are not there yet. The key change from today is that there is a change of sentiment within the market, and that key variable is how long does all this last?
OK, so we'll have to just keep watching. Kate English, Chief Economist with Deloitte Ireland, thank you for joining us on 6-1.